Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of kindness, love, and unexpected connections that change lives forever. Today's story is about Michael, a 16-year-old boy who, through his simple acts of kindness, forms a deep bond with an elderly woman, Mrs. Williams. Little did he know, his compassion would lead him down a path that would forever alter the course of his life. Stay tuned as we explore how one act of kindness can ripple through generations. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story with us. Michael was a 16-year-old boy living in the small, quiet town of Maplewood. His life, like the town itself, was simple and often overshadowed by the weight of everyday struggles. The cold winter months only seemed to amplify the challenges his family faced. His father worked long, grueling hours at a factory, and his mother, though battling ongoing health problems, did her best to manage the household. They lived paycheck to paycheck, never quite able to catch up with the bills piling up at the kitchen table. It was a hard life, but Michael had learned at an early age that kindness didn't cost a thing, and sometimes that was the only currency that mattered. Every winter, as the town was blanketed in heavy snow, Michael would grab his old shovel and set out into the streets. His mission was simple: clear driveways and sidewalks for anyone who needed help. He wasn't aiming to make a fortune, but the few extra dollars he earned from his efforts were enough to make a small dent in the family's financial troubles. More than that, he had come to see these little acts of kindness as a way of giving back to a community that had always been there for him, even if in subtle, unnoticed ways. On one particularly cold morning, Michael trudged through the snow, his breath visible in the crisp air, and his mind focused on the task ahead. He knew the streets well, each house with its unique charm, each driveway in need of clearing. As he walked, his gaze fell upon Mrs. Williams' house at the end of the street. It stood alone, a grand but weathered Victorian home that had seen better days. The house was no longer what it once had been, but still, it held a certain charm in the way the faded paint and sagging shutters spoke of a time long past. Mrs. Williams, the oldest resident in Maplewood, lived there alone. She was a woman of few words, known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense demeanor. Many in town viewed her as distant, even unapproachable, but Michael had always found her intriguing. There was something about her, a certain strength beneath the surface, that drew him in. As he approached her driveway, he noticed her struggling to open the front door, fighting against a heavy snowdrift that had built up overnight. Wrapped in layers of clothing to shield herself from the cold, her frail form trembled against the harsh winter winds. Even from a distance, Michael could see the discomfort etched across her face. Without hesitation, he rushed over to her, shovel in hand, and called out, "Good morning, Mrs. Williams. Need some help?" Her response was immediate, though tinged with a mixture of surprise and mild irritation. "Michael, you shouldn't be out in this cold," she replied, her voice harsh but not unkind. Then, with a softer note, she added, "But yes, I suppose I could use a hand." Michael grinned. "Consider it done," he said, his voice full of enthusiasm. As he worked, Mrs. Williams stood on the porch, occasionally offering advice with the precision of a seasoned teacher. "Don't just clear the middle. Make a proper path to the steps," she instructed, her tone brisk, though Michael could sense the faintest trace of gratitude in her words. When he finished clearing the snow, Mrs. Williams tried to hand him a few dollars. Michael, however, refused, shaking his head. "No need, Mrs. Williams. It's just nice to help," he said. For a moment, she looked at him closely, her sharp eyes softening. "You remind me of my husband," she said quietly, her voice carrying a sense of longing. "He was kind like you, always willing to lend a hand, no matter the circumstances." Michael, unsure of how to respond, simply smiled and nodded. "I'll check in on you next time it snows," he offered. Mrs. Williams hesitated before nodding her head. "That would be nice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. From that day on, Michael made it a point to visit Mrs. Williams whenever the snow fell. Sometimes, he would find small envelopes of cash tucked into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking. But more often than not, he left her house with nothing more than a warm cup of tea and a story from her past. She shared pieces of her life with him, bits and pieces of memories that had been buried in time, her years as a schoolteacher, the children she had taught, the love she had shared with her late husband, Henry. With a wistful smile, she even told Michael that she had never had children of her own. It just wasn't in the cards, she would say. So when Henry passed, it was just me. Michael felt a pang of sadness at her words. He couldn't imagine the loneliness she must have felt, living in that large, empty house with only memories to keep her company. Yet, there was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that Michael admired deeply. He began visiting her more often, shoveling her driveway, running small errands for her, and even fixing the squeaky gate in her yard. At home, life was becoming even more difficult. His father's hours at the factory were cut, and his mother's health continued to decline, leaving them with mounting bills. Michael worked odd jobs after school to help, but no matter how hard he tried, it never seemed to be enough. Yet, despite all their struggles, Michael never allowed his spirit to be broken. He found solace in his visits to Mrs. Williams, whose sharp wit and stories gave him a sense of purpose. A reminder that kindness could still be found, even in the coldest of winters. As winter gradually began to transform into spring, Michael's visits to Mrs. Williams became less about shoveling snow and more about companionship. They spent hours talking, often well into the evening, sipping tea in her parlor while the soft light of the setting sun filtered through the windows. Michael found that each conversation peeled back another layer of Mrs. Williams' life, revealing fragments of a story he had never expected to hear. She spoke of her youth, of the hopes and dreams she had once held, and of the immense love she had shared with Henry. She spoke of a time when the house had been full of laughter and life, when it had been a home in the truest sense of the word. In these quiet moments, Michael began to understand the depth of Mrs. Williams' loneliness. She had never had children of her own, and after Henry's passing, the house had become a silent witness to her grief. She had filled the empty rooms with books, trinkets, and memories of a life lived with purpose and passion. But it wasn't the same as having someone to share it all with. She told Michael, one day as they sat together, that she often thought of the things she had never done, the dreams she had let slip away. I always wanted to travel. You know, she confided, her voice tinged with regret. There were places I dreamt of seeing, adventures I wanted to have. But somehow, life always got in the way. And then, of course, Henry's passing changed everything. Suddenly, the world felt smaller, quieter. Michael could see the sadness in her eyes as she spoke, and it filled him with a sense of deep empathy. He didn't fully understand the pain of losing a partner, but he could imagine the loneliness that came with it. It wasn't just about the absence of a person, it was the absence of a shared life, a shared history, and the quiet understanding that comes from growing old together. Yet, as she spoke, there was something in her voice that reminded him of his own struggles. Despite the hardships his family faced, they were still together, still fighting to make ends meet. And in those moments with Mrs. Williams, he realized that even in the deepest grief, there was always room for kindness, for connection, and for love. One afternoon, as Michael helped her sort through some old boxes in the attic, Mrs. Williams took a moment to pause and look at him with a soft, almost wistful gaze. You know, Michael, she said slowly, you remind me so much of my husband. Michael, slightly taken aback by her words, stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. I do, he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Mrs. Williams nodded, her gaze distant as if lost in a memory. Henry was always kind to everyone, always willing to lend a hand. Just like you. He believed that the best way to live was by bringing light into the lives of others. Especially when your own days were hard. He never expected anything in return. It was his way of living. And in some ways, it's yours too. Michael felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He had never considered himself to be like Henry, but hearing Mrs. Williams speak so fondly of her late husband made him realize that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference. As the days passed, their bond deepened. It was no longer just about helping Mrs. Williams with the practicalities of life, it was about something more. Michael began to understand the importance of human connection, of the simple yet profound act of being there for someone, even in silence. Mrs. Williams had taught him that compassion wasn't just about offering assistance, it was about showing up, being present, and truly listening to the stories that made a person who they were. And as spring slowly unfurled its first blossoms in Maplewood, Michael's heart began to feel lighter. There was something about those visits with Mrs. Williams, something that filled a gap he hadn't realized existed in his life. His world, once defined by financial struggles and family hardship, was now infused with the lessons Mrs. Williams had quietly shared with him. He had learned that there was always more to a person than what met the eye. And that sometimes, kindness wasn't just about what you gave, it was about what you received in return. Yet, Michael never expected that Mrs. Williams' gratitude would manifest in a way he could never have imagined. He didn't anticipate that one day, in the quiet of her home, as they sat together in the fading light of another afternoon, Mrs. Williams would make a decision that would change his life forever. It wasn't just about the simple gifts of tea and stories anymore, it was about something deeper. Something that would define the next chapter of his life. As spring blossomed around Maplewood, life seemed to slow down. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and the snow that once blanketed the streets melted away, giving way to fresh grass and the soft colors of new life. For Michael, these changes symbolized more than just the end of winter, they marked the growth of a bond that had quietly formed over the months with Mrs. Williams. What had started as small acts of kindness had slowly transformed into a deep, meaningful connection between them. One that transcended age, circumstance, and even the boundaries of time. Every time Michael visited, he found himself drawn into the rhythm of Mrs. Williams' world. They would sit together in her cozy parlor, sipping tea, sharing stories, and discussing everything from the weather to the books they loved. He had come to cherish these moments, not only for the warmth they provided him in the midst of his own struggles but also for the lessons he was learning along the way. Mrs. Williams, though weathered by life's challenges, had a wealth of wisdom to offer, and it was through her stories that Michael began to see the world in a different light. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the room, Mrs. Williams turned to Michael with an expression that caught his attention. There was something in her eyes, a softness, a sincerity that made him pause. "Michael," she began, her voice calm but laden with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you." He sat up straight, the weight of her tone making him instinctively nervous. "What is it, Mrs. Williams?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. She smiled faintly, her hands folding in her lap as she took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about you lately, about how you've been there for me, how you've shown kindness when I've needed it most." Her voice faltered for a moment, as if the words were difficult to form. But then she continued, "And I've made some decisions that I've been holding on to for quite some time." Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't know what she was about to say, but something told him it was important. He stayed silent, giving her the space to speak freely. She looked at him, her eyes steady now. "When I pass, Michael, everything I have will go to you. My house, my savings. It's all yours." The words hit Michael like a punch to the chest. He blinked, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. "Mrs. Williams, you don't have to do that," he stammered, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's too much. I'm just here to help." You don't owe me anything. But Mrs. Williams raised a hand, silencing him. I don't owe you anything, Michael. But I want you to have it. I have no family left, no children, no nieces, no nephews. And you've shown me something that I didn't think I would ever find again: kindness. Real, pure kindness. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. I want you to have it all because I know you'll take care of it. You'll honor it. You've reminded me that there is still good in the world. And that's a gift that I can never repay. Michael was at a loss for words. His mind raced. But no coherent thought could form. The enormity of her gift, the responsibility that came with it, felt too heavy for someone like him to bear. How could he accept something so precious? How could he possibly be worthy of it? Seeing the conflict in his eyes, Mrs. Williams placed a gentle hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for her age. I've lived a long life, Michael. I've seen much. And I've learned that life isn't about the things we accumulate. It's about the connections we make, the kindness we share, and the lives we touch. You've touched mine in ways I can't even express. And for that, I will always be grateful. Michael swallowed hard, his emotions swirling. I don't know what to say, he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude and confusion. You don't need to say anything, she replied softly. Just promise me that you'll take care of it all. Not for me, but for yourself. And for those who come after you. Michael nodded slowly, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He wasn't sure what the future held or how he could possibly live up to such a gift. But one thing was clear: Mrs. Williams had placed her trust in him. And that trust, he knew, was something sacred. As the evening wore on and the sun finally set, Michael sat quietly with Mrs. Williams, his mind reeling from her words. He couldn't quite fathom the weight of the responsibility she had placed upon him. But he knew deep down that this was more than just an inheritance, it was a legacy. A legacy of kindness, love, and a life well lived. And in that moment, Michael made a silent vow: he would honor her memory. And he would do everything in his power to fulfill the promise she had entrusted to him. As the months passed, Michael's life transformed in ways he hadn't imagined. The house that once felt like a symbol of loneliness became a sanctuary for the community, just as Mrs. Williams had hoped. With the help of neighbors, friends, and local businesses, Michael turned the old Victorian home into a vibrant place where kindness and connection flourished. The parlor, once a quiet room filled with the weight of memories, became a cozy space where children gathered after school to read, learn, and laugh. The dining room transformed into a community kitchen, where meals were prepared and shared among those in need. Even the garden, once covered in snow, bloomed with life in the spring, offering fresh produce and beauty to the neighborhood. As he stood on the porch one warm evening, watching the children run through the yard while adults chatted over cups of tea, Michael felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Mrs. Williams' dream had come to life. And it was more than he could have ever hoped for. The house had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that kindness, even in its smallest forms, could ripple out and change the world in unexpected ways. Michael knew that Mrs. Williams had entrusted him with something far more valuable than money or property. She had given him the tools to create a space where people could connect, support one another, and find the strength to face life's challenges together. In that moment, Michael realized that her legacy wasn't just in the walls of the house, it was in the lives he had touched, the compassion he had shared, and the kindness that would live on, long after the snow had melted. If you enjoyed this life story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated with more inspiring videos.